Okay, so welcome to Unit 5, the unit on revolutions. Today, we will focus on the first topic, understanding why 1750 and 1900 is a time period. Now, to give you a little bit of background here, our next two units, Unit 5, Revolution, and Unit 6, the consequences of industrialization, both take place during the time period 1750 to 1900. So this is going to be something new that we haven't done before. So our learning target, our essential question today that you need to get from doing this lesson is, why do historians define this time period, 1750 to 1900, as a period in world history? So when we go through this lesson, okay, we need to understand that we are explaining why historians define it. So we're talking about the relationship between certain developments and certain events and how they kind of affected the processes worldwide. So the way this lesson's going to work is I'm going to take a couple minutes to introduce what we're talking about today, the skill known as periodization. Then I'm going to give you a task to do. I'm going to ask you to look up and define the 5 most important terms that apply to this time period. Now, after we do this, I'm going to present my argument that is going to address the questions. As you do that, you're going to take notes. And then at the end of this, you will be able to use those notes on the 5.0 assessment. This assessment will be writing, and it will count as a formative grade. So, what is this lesson about? This is your introduction, and it's about a skill known as periodization. Now, we have not introduced this, but we know this. When we look at history, could be the history of you, the history of me, the history of Denmark High School, or the history of the world, we divide that history into periods or ages. So as you can see by these pictures, we're looking at the normal ages that a human goes through. They start off as a baby, goes through their teenage years, becomes an adult, and becomes an old adult, and eventually dies. But what we're after is, how do we define these different periods? Well, we look at defining each period not by age, but by abilities, by the common way that people live their lives. So if you look at a baby's life is very basic, and he is very dependent on other people to survive, much like humanity through the pre-civilization periods. Then we get to a teenager. A teenager is developing the skills and the mental processes to be independent. But according to the law and really according to their growth, they're not independent yet. Then we become an adult. And life totally changes with being an adult, because on one hand, you get your freedoms, but on the second hand, you have lots of responsibilities. And then, of course, we have old age, which, we have all this wisdom and we eventually die. So historians take that idea and they apply a skill known as periodization. So what we just did is I kind of showed you what periodization is. So to give you an official definition, which you don't need to write down, but historical thinking involves the ability to describe, analyze, and evaluate the different ways that historians divide history into discrete and definable periods. Historians construct and debate different, sometimes competing models of periodization. The choice of specific turning points or starting and ending dates might accord a higher value from one narrative, region, or group than another. So to kind of explain this, a historian looks at the path of history and basically divides that history into discrete and definable periods called ages. And essentially, some things that define these ages would be not only start dates, end dates, and turning points, but also the characteristics that define life. So when we go back to this question, what we're really doing through explaining is we're identifying that the overall idea that defines the age, the key dates, and we're identifying and describing the characteristics that define the period. So, what this lesson is about, and how to answer this question, is to look at the time period 1750 to 1900 and basically say, okay, this is a time period because of these overall ideas. They all revolve around the word modern. And then, secondly, we take a look at the dates. What are the key dates of the modern age? And then finally, when we look at the big picture as to how people live their lives, we're identifying and describing the different characteristics that are going to be used to define the period, because a time period is defined not only by overall ideas and dates, but also the shared characteristics of survival and prosperity. Now, this is something new that actually is somewhat easy. I don't want you to freak out about this and say this is hard, but just remember these three things that are going to go into answer those questions. So, this is task number one. Task number one is basically focusing on the 5 key terms that define this time period. These terms will not only help us understand overall what this period is about, but also understand the defining global processes that kind of define it. So, the key terms that I want you to focus on is revolution. And I want you to pay attention that revolutions are not always violent. The Enlightenment, not the idea of Buddhism, industrialization, also known as the Industrial Revolution, something known as empiricism, and finally, imperialism. So you're going to use your technology and you're going to look up and define each term. My suggestion is maybe you can find a Unit 5 Quizlet or whatever, website that you can go and get it from another teacher. But I want you not only to define it, but I want you to think about this, how this applies to history, and why would it be important to this period. So the one that I'm going to show you as an example is socialism. So socialism is defined as an ideology that seeks to fix the problems of society through public ownership of some or all of the means of production. So between 1750 and 1900, an ism known as socialism arises. And it is arguing that, okay, the means of production, meaning the factories, the resources, and things like that, should be owned publicly to further share the wealth. So, this is important during this time period because it's going to cause a great deal of conflict between the factory workers and the owners of the factories. And remember that this is designed to make things more fair. So, what I want you to do now is take some time. I want you on your own sheet of paper to write and define these terms and to think about how this would be important for the time period 1750 to 1900.